Welcome to Annapolis Mosaics. Our program spotlights people in our community who are involved in activities designed to promote good human relations. I am Michael Keller, the chair of the Annapolis Human Relations Commission and your host. The commission is a city board that seeks to promote equal opportunity and eliminate discrimination. My guests today are Bob Welnick and Sharon Sellers from the AARP Tax Aide program. Bob and Sharon, welcome to Annapolis Mosaics.
Thank you, Michael.
Well, what services does the AARP Tax Aide program provide?
We provide assistance to community citizens in filing their tax returns, both federal and state.
Okay, all right. How long has the program existed, and approximately how many people have been helped during its lifetime?
The program itself has been in existence. This is its 51st year. How many people have been served? I have no clue.
We routinely serve about between 2,500 and 3,000 people in the county over the course of a tax season.
Mm-hmm.
So if you multiply that by 50 some years, it's a fairly significant number of people who've been helped.
And that's just here in Annapolis and Anne Arundel County.
This
is a national
Yes.
project, as I understand it.
It is.
So you're talking about tens of thousands of people probably who have been
You're
served.
talking millions.
Millions who have been served by it. That's really extraordinary. Well, who is eligible to receive assistance?
Anybody.
So there's no restriction in terms of by income or by any other qualification?
There are certain types of tax returns that we can't do.
Okay.
Okay. For example, if you're renting out a home,
Mm-hmm.
we aren't qualified to do those.
Okay.
Okay. We aren't qualified to do farm returns.
Okay.
But beyond that, there are no income restrictions. There's no age restrictions. We help the young and the old.
Okay.
We have a focus on the elderly,
Mm-hmm.
but that does not preclude others from coming in.
All right. Could you describe what you would consider say, a typical client?
I would say the typical one are senior citizens who are living on Social Security
Mm-hmm.
with maybe a small pension of some kind,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's an IRA or an actual pension
Mm-hmm.
or something like that. But those are probably the typical people
Mm-hmm.
that we serve.
Right. Lots of retirees.
There's a lot of that, yeah.
Okay.
Although I will say that one of the libraries I work at is over on the Broadneck Peninsula, and we're increasingly seeing younger people, so people who are in their very first job, maybe they still live at home with their parents, and their parents come to the service to have their taxes done, so they bring the child with them as well. So 16, 17-year-olds, maybe even somebody in college or somebody who has their first job. So it does differ at the sites that you work at. If you're working in a more retirement-oriented community, you do tend to get people like what Bob says. If you're working in a more suburban environment, then we are starting to see younger people come to take advantage of the service as well.
Uh-huh. And where actually are the sites that you provide assistance located? Where do you actually?
We have 7 sites within the county that are in the public libraries.
Okay.
We have 6 sites that are at the county senior centers,
Mm-hmm.
as well as a couple of, one's a church, one is a senior citizens retirement community in Annapolis, and then we've got a couple of special sites that we go to that are for the developmentally disabled.
Mm-hmm.
Bella McCree and Langton Green.
Okay. And you also offer tax assistance online too. Is that correct? Do you know?
I haven't done any online, but I have been receiving phone calls from people.
Okay.
So someplace my cell phone number has been published either on a library site or the AARP site, because I've had maybe a half dozen phone calls from people asking either where they can take advantage of the service or asking very specific questions about tax-related issues, but not online so far.
Okay, right. My guess is that's going to come about sooner or later, because
Yeah,
so many,
it very well could be.
you know, and in terms of just the ease of it, rather,
Well-
people have to travel and the like.
Yeah, but one of the issues would be, one of the requirements that we have is you get your return, the assistance in preparing your return. We're
Okay.
not doing the return,
Okay,
okay? But you get the assistance of one of the counselors, and then a second counselor who is equally qualified does a complete review
Okay.
of the return.
okay.
So when you get online, you get into a little bit of a bind as to how you do that.
Oh, you brought up the issue of the counselors, and obviously you're volunteers in doing this.
Yes,
Taxes are complicated.
can be.
You know, and they can be very complicated. What training does the AARP tax aid program provide to those who are providing help?
Since Sharon is one of our instructors, I'll let her deal
Okay.
with that.
So we have a pretty comprehensive training program. It runs over about 40 hours, usually in the January timeframe, and we offer training on tax law and any changes in tax law, the tax software that we use, and then we also focus on commonly seen situations,
Okay.
things that are very specific to Maryland or to Anne Arundel County that perhaps are not relevant in other states, and I'm fairly sure that other counties and other states do something similar. So we run this training over the course of about 10 days. We have a very robust certification process, so each volunteer who's going to be preparing the tax returns has to pass IRS tests in standards of conduct, in how to conduct an interview in order to get all the necessary information to do the taxes, and then also to do returns themselves. So questions on tax law, preparing practice returns, and then checking those answers to make sure they're correct. This year we had a new requirement for 2 proficiency returns, which is, we didn't do this in the prior years that I've been a volunteer, where we actually had 2 named returns that we gave out to all the volunteers. Keith and I, who's the primary instructor, we had the answers. And so we sort of graded people. You know, if they didn't get the answer the first time, we'd say, well, have you considered this? So we guided them to the correct answer, and it was really a learning experience for every individual counselor on what did they know and what didn't they know and where did they need to improve. And then in addition, we also do Maryland training. So not appropriate for states that have no state income tax, but Maryland does, and it's pretty complex in Maryland. There are a lot of subtractions, there are a lot of additions to your federal income. So we do the training on Maryland, and then we also have a Maryland test. So we really do the best we can to make sure that people are spun up on what all the changes are and what we think we might be facing, you know, in the current year, especially important in a year like this where we've had a fairly major federal tax law change at the end of 2017.
And you know, with respect to the major change in it, what in the new tax code, which got a pretty big overhaul by Congress in this last iteration, what are the changes that you believe are most important for the average tax payer to be aware of?
That's a tough one. Because it's actually twofold. There were changes in the tax law which changed the tax brackets, the
Okay.
percentage.
Right.
And a lot of employers attempted to implement that.
Okay.
And in some cases, they did a good job of it. In other cases, it was a little bit weak, and so people are ending up owing this year where last year they got a refund. So it's a case of making sure the client understands what has happened and why there's a difference.
Yeah, there's been a lot of coverage in the
Yes, there
papers
has.
recently
Yes, there has.
about Marylanders who have filled out their taxes, and in the past they have gotten refunds, and this year they're finding that their refunds have shrunk. or in some cases, they actually owe money.
Yeah.
I read one account of an individual who said that he and his wife are going to have to rent out a room in their home in order to be able to afford paying the taxes. I'm sure that's an extreme case. Or
I would think it would be an extreme case.
An extreme
yeah,
case. But the changes in law, specifically as it relates, I think, to the deduction for state and local income and the capping of the state and local income at $10,000 might be one factor. Would there be other factors that would cause that shift to occur?
Yeah, because in the past you had a standard deduction of approximately $6,000 for a single individual, but you also had, I believe it was like $4,050 last year, personal exemption. The personal exemption has gone away, but the standard deduction has been doubled. So for a single person, instead of $6,350, I think it was last year, it's $12,000 this year. That changes whether or not somebody will itemize their deductions or not, because now trying to get to 12,000 itemized deductions is a lot tougher.
Right.
So that changes the dynamics of the whole scenario. Then when you get into the state of Maryland, Maryland did not take into account a lot of the federal changes when they made changes to the state law. So if you are used to itemizing on your federal return, then you would itemize on your state return. Well, if you don't itemize on your federal, can you itemize on the state or not, and how does that play out? And it's complex, to say the least.
Yeah, and the Maryland General Assembly and the governor sort of decided not to do anything immediately on it, and because they would get, from the state level, they would get a big financial windfall from this thing.
Yes.
And also, I think there was a legitimate concern on their part that if they did tinker with it, that the situation could result in a situation where there would be a shortfall for the state. And so I think they sort of sat back and watched. But this year they're going to probably have to take a look at it, because there's a lot of very upset taxpayers when you're expecting a refund and suddenly you have to pay money. That can be upsetting to people.
So Maryland did do two things. They did raise the standard deduction for both a single person and a married person by very small amounts, $250 for a single person, $500 for a married couple. And they also retained the personal exemption, which the federal government discontinued for the 2018 tax year. So they did keep some things, but they didn't divorce the need to itemize on your state taxes from itemizing on your federal taxes. So you don't have that choice. You must do it. One of the things that we're able to do when we do somebody's taxes is, of course, we're taking into account the totality of their tax picture.
Right.
What did you owe the federal government? What did you owe the state government? Are you getting any refunds back? And we can actually do a little calculation that looks at somebody's itemized deductions, even if they don't meet the standard deduction threshold, to see whether they might be better off itemizing on their federal return so that they can itemize on their state return. Even if they pay more federal tax, they might pay a lot less Maryland tax. And taking those two together, you might find they're in a better tax situation. I've had a couple of instances of that already. But I will tell you, Michael, that the majority of people I'm seeing now are not itemizing. Even before, I would have expected to see, at least some significant percentage itemizing, especially in this area where people own homes or do charitable deductions or have a fairly significant property tax bill. And I think maybe in the first 3 weeks, so we're in our third week now, I think maybe I've only had one return where somebody itemized. And I had to force that to make it itemized because they were better off for Maryland. So I think that's a pretty significant change for this year.
I would assume that the greater majority of the work that the tax aid program does comes in that first quarter of the year as we get to April the 15th. However, do you do this kind of work year-round? To what extent do you have customers in the?
Generally, no.
Okay.
We do probably 99% of our work in the first quarter.
Right.
if somebody that we did a return for were to receive a letter from the IRS, either good or bad, they can contact us, and we would have one or two of us get with them and go over what the letter says and what it means in terms of their specific
Right.
tax scenario.
Yeah, yeah, I'm sure
So
you
they
get.
at least understand it.
Yeah, I'm sure you get a lot of the calls or contacts from people who will say, I just received a letter from the IRS. What do I do about this? I'm sure that's a big part of the business.
Where they come and sit down with you, and one of the questions that we ask people is, have you received any correspondence from the IRS? And then they pull out a letter from the IRS.
Yeah.
And there are a variety of reasons why you could have a letter. Some of them are completely benign reasons,
Yeah.
nothing to worry about. And we might do, especially if it's a community like Heritage
Right.
Harbor, where a lot of people know each other and we volunteer there if they need an amended return after the tax season is open. Because amended returns are all paper returns, you mail those in. But our ability to e-file, so that's to electronically send the tax return to the IRS and to the state of Maryland, that closes on the 15th of April. Although I do think this year it closes on the 16th of April, right? No, is it the 15th?
This year it's the 15th.
Okay. Some years we get a couple of
Some years
extra
it's
days.
16th or 17th, depending on DC holidays.
Right.
But that's all.
Right. Does your organization cooperate in any way with the Internal Revenue Service? You collaborate with them?
Oh, yes.
So there's
Most
a
of it.
close working relationship.
The software that we use is certified by the IRS.
Right.
The training that we go through, with the exception of the state of Maryland, obviously, is from the IRS. It's their requirements that we're meeting.
We also have the IRS has the responsibility to come out and do spot checks. So we could be running a site in the Eastport Library or at the Annapolis Senior Center, and somebody from the IRS will come out unannounced. You don't know that until the day that they're arriving, and they want to look at, do you have all of the documentation that's available to allow you to do taxes? Do you have all of the paperwork posted that tells the taxpayer about their rights and responsibilities and what the service is? And then they usually want to sit with somebody who's preparing a return, and then they want to sit with the person who does the quality check on the return to make sure that all of the guidelines are being followed appropriately.
Yeah.
Did the government shutdown and the furloughing of IRS employees impact your services in any way?
Yeah, it did. It made a lot of the documentation slow in getting out because they were not there to make the final approvals on various versions. The same with a lot of the software. I'm not sure why, but I know there are still states that have not approved the forms that are in the software product that we're using for mail-in. So you get some issues that way. And so there was just, the general delay in getting things done is the way it impacted most of it.
Can people expect greater delays now that the shutdown is passed in terms of getting responses from IRS when people call or ask for information over the internet?
If you're calling the IRS, I'm not aware of what the timelines would be in getting responses to it. I know that in terms of getting your refund when we electronically file,
Right.
it is not having any impact.
Okay.
People are able to get both their federal and their state refunds within a matter of about a week.
The people we did the very first week, some of them came back last week and said, oh, I've already gotten my refund, especially with Maryland. Maryland is usually fairly quick if you e-file. Federal government, it takes a little bit longer, but the people who came on the 1st and 2nd of February already have the money in their bank accounts now.
Yeah.
I would expect that many of our viewers have a pressing question in their mind as it relates to taxes. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to mention areas of the tax code and give you the opportunity to say, okay, here's the kinds of questions that we most commonly get. So and here is the kind of answers we might give.
Okay.
So this is sort of like a little quiz on this, but if I hit something, you say, we have no idea, then I'll just simply go on to the next one. But I thought rather than just give you a question such as, what are the kind of frequent questions you get? That's such a broad question that it would be difficult. So let's just talk about specific areas. Let's say you have someone who is self-employed. What are some of the frequent questions that you would get from someone who is self-employed?
That we get from them?
From them.
Okay.
In words,
What
some
kind
issue.
of things can they deduct
Okay.
from their self-employment income?
Right.
The biggest change this year in that regards is what's called the qualified business deduction.
Income deduction.
Income deduction, yeah,
Okay.
QBI. And that's a complicated issue to try to describe, but in a nutshell, you can get 20% reduction in your net income, I believe.
You get a credit for up to 20% of the net income from your self-employed business minus the self-employment tax that you're required to pay, and another new thing, which is the self-employed health insurance deduction. So some percentage of your self-employment income may be eligible for this 20% credit.
Okay. All right. How about someone who is in the process of selling their home? What kind of issues usually come up with that? What are some of the frequent questions you get?
Make sure you hang on to all of the paperwork you get. One of the things that they tend not to bring is the settlement sheet. And the settlement sheet shows a lot of detail on the taxes that are being taken out of the sale price and some of the other expenses that can be deducted. You also need the settlement sheet basically for the original purchase of it. And so you got to have a lot of paperwork in order to start dealing with the sale of a home.
I find a lot of people still are confused about whether or not they have to pay tax on the sale of their primary home. Even though the rules on that changed back in about, I think it was 1995 or 1996. If you recall, we used to have like what we called a carry forward, right? So that went away in those days, and now it's as long as your profit is under $500,000 for a married couple, $250,000 for a single person, there isn't any tax liability. So even though that's now almost over 20 years ago, people still have in their minds that they might have to pay tax on the sale of their primary residence. Very different, of course, if you're renting out a residence.
Oh yeah, because now you're dealing with the business side of it.
How about retirement income? You mentioned that your chief clients are often individuals who are in a retirement situation. Many of them depend on income from a variety of different sources, including Social Security, pensions, and from accounts like IRAs and 501ks and the like. What are some of the frequent questions you get from retirees that relate specifically to their income situation?
Yeah. So how much of my retirement income is actually taxable? Many people know that some states don't tax your retirement income at all, especially for people who are transplants into the state of Maryland, where there's states like Pennsylvania that don't tax your retirement income. Maryland, of course, does up to above $30,600 as long as you're over 65. They give you a little tax break there. So people want to know how much of their IRA is taxable, how much of their retirement income is taxable, how much of their Social Security income is taxable, and that's you have to look at every individual's numbers, because it's impossible to predict without looking at their numbers how much of their income will be taxable.
And how about filing requirements and status?
So another question we get is, do I even need to file? I only have retirement income, I only have Social Security. Is there an income level under which you must file, over which you must file, or under which you don't have to file? There is an income limit, but we have a couple of reasons why we tell people, even who they're retirees, that maybe they might want to file. The first is if you ever have to go into assisted living or you need care and you have to prove what your income was in any particular year, your tax return is a really easy way to do that. And even more importantly is my second reason, which is if somebody files a tax return with your Social Security number, nobody else can file one. So it's a real identity theft protection, even for people who don't legitimately need to file, then nobody else can then steal your identity using your Social Security number. So that's what I recommend to people is let's file for you anyway. For Maryland, I still recommend it, even if you don't have to file for the federal return, but you do have to file for Maryland. I still recommend filing for a federal return, even if you don't technically have to.
And how about claiming dependents? What kinds of questions do you get about that?
There are some new rules this year on dependents. As Bob already mentioned, you used to get a personal exemption for every dependent on your return. That's gone away for the 2018 tax year. But we now have a credit for other dependents. So if you have a parent who lives with you, or you have an adult child who perhaps is not capable of living on their own, there is a small tax credit that you can get for those people. There's a very specific set of rules and actually like a little questionnaire tree that we do with people that asks questions about is this your son or your daughter or your grandchild? How much money did they earn? Did they live with you for the entirety of the year or only part of the year? How much support do they provide for themselves, and how much support do you provide for them? And all of those factors go into the decision of whether or not they qualify as your dependent, either as your child dependent or as another dependent. So again, a very sort of complex set of questions to make that determination.
And how about the whole issue of withholding versus making estimated taxes reports?
If you are retired, you're going to probably need to do estimated taxes, because you can try to calculate it, but most retirement plans don't do the calculation for you. So you would be better off taking your last year's return, and if you owed, then paying a quarter of what you owed extra out of your payment each quarter as you go along. If you don't, then you face the possibility of getting hit with some penalties because you didn't pay it on a rotating basis like that.
And we can actually figure that out when a taxpayer is with us. If it looks like they owe money, we can help them figure out what those estimated taxes for each quarter will be, and we can also print out the vouchers so that they don't have to go and find them, especially for people who are retirees. Some of them don't have internet access, so as much information as we can give them before they leave the table, we think the better off they'll be in the coming year.
Well, I am certain that our viewers are going to have lots and lots of questions about it, and I think being acquainted with your service is going to be extremely useful to them. Could you provide some information about how folks can get in touch with the AARP Tax Aid program, a telephone number, website, email address, and also what kinds of documents should they bring to a session that they have with you, so that to make sure that everything that you need to help them is going to be on the table?
All right, let's start with the beginning. The taxpayer, and if there is one, the spouse, we need to have some kind of a government-issued photo ID, as well as their Social Security card, or the SSA 1099, which is coming from the Social Security Administration. We need Social Security cards for anybody who is being claimed as a dependent on that tax return. We need any kind of income documentation, whether they're W-2s, 1099-Rs, SSA 1099s, interest 1099 INTs, dividend statements from their brokerage, 1099B capital gain statements, any of those kind of documents we would need. If they are going to try to itemize, they need to have totaled receipts for medical expenses, for charitable contributions that are cash, as well as separately charitable contributions of in-kind items. Beyond that, I can't think of anything else primary.
And how can they get in touch with you?
So generally we advise people to come into one of the sites to ask the questions, because the interaction with a person in person is always easier than over the phone if we can. They don't have to have their tax return done by us. We will answer questions, at a site. And then, you're familiar with the expression, it takes a village. Well, we usually have 6 or 7 preparers at each site, including somebody who's fairly senior. who has a long history with AARP or a long history in taxes. So even if one of the more junior counselors doesn't know the answer, then somebody there probably does know the answer. So we often consult with each other. So that's really the best way to reach us. We did provide you with a list of the sites and the times that they're open. So people can come along to those sites and visit us, and if there's somebody free, we'll be happy to sit down with them and answer their questions there.
Thank you for viewing our program, and please join us again on Annapolis Mosaics. If you would like more information about the Annapolis Human Relations Commission, jot down the information that's on your screen. You can reach us at 410-263-7998 or by email at hrcommission@annapolis.gov, or check out our page at the City of Annapolis website. Go to www.annapolis.gov, click on City Government, then Boards and Commissions, and scroll down to the Human Relations Commission page. And always remember the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said, "We have flown the air like birds and swum the seas like fishes, but have yet to learn the simple act of walking the earth as brothers and sisters."